What is going on, football fans? Back at it with another New York Giants video. Excited to jump into this video with you guys, in which I really dive into the New York Giants roster, at least as currently constructed. I guess you could call it a way too early 53-man roster prediction video, but it's more so just looking at the roster, talking about the roster, talking about some of the strengths and weaknesses, some of the areas where I could see Joe Shane making a small move here or there. Of course, at this point, we have a pretty good idea of what this Giants roster is going to look like going into the 2023 season. But I could certainly see the Giants making some small moves leading up into camp, potentially make a couple of small moves as other teams cut down on their roster. Shane kind of talked about that in his last press conference. And I'll talk about some of the areas where I think right now the New York Giants are thinnest throughout this video. But if you follow the team, I think you know there's a couple of areas on defense where at least we're thin, but we're much improved throughout the entirety of this roster. Also, if you guys have any video ideas, drop them in the comments below. I want to be much more active this offseason. Last year, I kind of took a monster break between like May and, late till like mid to late July. This year, I want to have at least a weekly video. I have a plan to take, something like like a hot take, perhaps an opinion piece once a week throughout the offseason. But any like idea for a series or anything you would like to watch on the channel, always open to ideas. I want to try to go live a little bit more. I'm going to go live for the schedule release. I already know that. And I think that's on the 11th. So I'll be live for that. Always love talking New York Giants football with you guys. But let's dive into it. Before we look at this year's roster, I just wanted to briefly, not going to go over every name, but briefly look at the 53-man roster last year in comparison to this year. Quarterback's the same. Running back we'll get into in a bit, but not a dramatic change. Obviously, a big upgrade at the tight end. The defense, the offensive line last year, it's obviously going to be somewhat similar, but we added a big rookie that we'll get into throughout this video. Last year, you look at some of these names, Max Garcia. We all forgot about him. Devery Hamilton, right? The wide receiving core, we all know how that played out. One of the worst wide receiving cores in football. Kenny Golladay didn't work out as we were all hoping. Wandell got hurt midseason. Shepard got hurt before the year really got underway. David Sills, need I say more? Kadarius Toney never really took a snap with the Giants. So we all know that worked out. It was not deep at all. That is something that you could certainly say has a lot more talent on it this year and is certainly a lot deeper. As a matter of fact, you could argue the wide receiver position for this year's roster, at least right now as it appears, maybe the deepest on this year's football team. As far as the DBs goes at the cornerback and the safety spots, some of the similar names there, but expect to see a lot of fresh new faces here with this year's draft class. And I do think we're much deeper at that position as well. Defensive line, somewhat similar, but with some of the top heavy guys, but we added a lot more depth at that position. That one really stands out. And of course, Okereke at the inside linebacker position. Look at those names last year. Tate Crowder, Austin Calitro, Blake Martinez, who never really made the team. And then at the outside linebacker spot, we're still really thin there. I think that's something that we need to improve upon. And the special teams, obviously, we figure probably will remain the same. But that was the 53-man roster last year, obviously headed by Gano, Gillen, and Casey Kreider. Gillen, of course, was brought back on a contract, which was surprising to me. I thought that they would at least bring in some competition. They still may. But Jamie Gillen didn't have the best year last year for the New York Giants. But obviously, they see something in the young punter. And we'll see how it all plays out this year. But yeah, Graham Gano, of course, is money. I think one of the most underappreciated players on this team. You can make an argument he's one of the 10 best players on this team. He's that good of a kicker. You can make an argument he was probably the MVP of the offense throughout the first half of last year's season, outside of probably Saquon Barkley. So he was great last year, came up with so many money kicks for this football team. So happy to see that he's back. And we'll see how Gillen produces. So we talked about the special teams in terms of that. So that leaves open 50 roster positions for the New York Giants. And there's going to be a lot of camp battles, and we're going to get into them in this video. The quarterback position is cut and dry. It's going to be the same two as last year. I expect the New York Giants to go with two quarterbacks. Last year, they went with two quarterbacks, obviously with Daniel Jones and Tyrod Taylor. They brought in DeVito as an undrafted free agent. My guess is they're probably going to stick him on the practice squad. I don't expect him to crack this year's roster. Next year, it will be interesting to see what the Giants decide to do with that backup quarterback spot. Do they extend Tyrod Taylor, or do they look for a cheap alternative, being that they're starting to pay Daniel Jones a lot more money, and you need to try to find ways to get creative in terms of freeing up cap space throughout the roster? You may not want to pay your backup quarterback top dollar, but of course, a backup quarterback is important, especially when you have a quarterback like Daniel Jones, who in the past, due to his style of play, has been, prone to miss a few games due to the fact that he runs the ball, he takes hits, so on and so forth. Last year was his first year since being in the pros where he didn't miss a game. So we'll see where they go long-term with that. But this year, yeah, it's obvious. It's going to be Jones. It's going to be Taylor. Jones, I expect to take a big step up because of a lot of the additions on this roster on the offensive side of the football, along with being more familiar within this offense with Brian Dable. Obviously, the player that I'm probably most looking forward to going into this year. You really want to see if Daniel Jones could start to anoint himself as a top 10 quarterback in the NFL. I think a lot of people are going to have those expectations going into the year, and we'll see if Daniel Jones will be able to match it. But excited to see number 8 under center this year after he got his $40 million a year extension. Next up, at the running back position, well, you know the head man in charge there. That's Saquon Barkley. And yes, I understand he still hasn't signed his contract extension. I understand he's still on the tag. He hasn't signed the tag. I think in the end, as I've said now for several weeks, cooler heads will prevail. I expect Saquon Barkley back with this football team. I think it's the best move for him. I think it's the best move for the New York Giants. The only question becomes, are they able to get a long-term contract extension done? Barkley last year had a resurgence, and I knew he would going into the year. Obviously, the mental aspect of it. You know, he may have been physically recovered from that horrible injury, but he did not appear to be fully confident in his body. I don't think he trusted his body so much the year after that incident. Last year, you could see he was putting his head down. He was running hard. This year, I do think we have a deeper running back core, which I think is great for the Giants and even better for Saquon Barkley. I think it'll make him more productive throughout the course of the year. Sometimes quality is better than quantity, and I think you're going to get a lot of quality out of Saquon Barkley this year with the addition of some of the members in the backfield for the New York Giants at the running back position. Obviously, outside of Saquon Barkley, the most obvious name there is Matt Breida. And I actually think Matt Breida is one of the more underrated players from last year's team. He didn't get a whole lot of touches. I was hoping he would get more throughout the course of the season because I wanted to spell Barkley, but he was so important to this team, so I understood why the Giants used him as much as they did. But if you watched over the last 4 or 5 games last year, they really started to use Saquon more and more in the passing game. And if they could trust this offensive line more, expect them to use Barkley more in passing situations. The guy that I'm excited about that I could see having at least a small effect on this offense this year in his rookie year is the 5th-round pick, Eric Gray. And I talked about it in my prior video. I think Gray projects to be an Ahmad Bradshaw-like running back. Will he be as successful as Bradshaw? Well, that's going to be tough. Bradshaw was a great player for the Giants, but of course, he also ran behind an incredible offensive line. So hopefully we could develop this offensive line as such. I think Gray's got pass catching capability. He runs hard. He's, as I said in my last video, he's impressive. And he's a guy that I certainly could see spelling Barkley. And maybe Barkley, instead of getting 20 carries a game, gets 14 and he gets a few more catches. But he's more productive with the touches that he does have. I think Gray definitely is a massive upgrade in terms of the depth in this running back core. And I think it's something that we really needed. In terms of the other competition there, you're looking at Gary Brightwell. And we'll see. I mean, I think we all remember Brightwell was brought in on this team mainly for special teams purposes. That's all you heard after the New York Giants drafted him. I don't think he ever surpassed like 500 yards in a single season at the collegiate level. Hasn't gotten much of an opportunity to, run the football with the Giants. Maybe it may have had a little over 100 yards last year. He does run hard, and he was our kick returner last year, but that job could easily be given to Gray. That job could easily be given to Crowder, if he makes the team, right? He's got kick returning experience. So I don't think it's a shoo-in that he will be back with this football team. All of it's going to depend on how many running backs they go with. Last year, I believe they went with 5, but one of those included the H-back and Chris Myrick, who certainly could be back with this team as well, being that even though we don't have a fullback, you want a blocking option at that tight end position. So he was listed as a fullback last year for the New York Giants, playing that H-back role. We'll see how many running backs they go with. That, I suppose, is the question. If they go with 5, you have to figure Gary Brightwell stands a very good chance to make this football team. He's a good special teams contributor, but I think the clear top 3 are Saquon, Breida, and the rookie Gray. And I think that's a nice addition to that core. Next up, we're going to talk about the wide receiver position. And there you're looking at a guy who actually had a nice resurgent season, who's had good chemistry with Daniel Jones throughout the course of his career, and that, of course, being Darius Slayton. Last year, a lot of people felt, like myself included, based off the reports you were hearing, based off his contract, knowing that we had to get under budget, there was a very good chance he wasn't going to make this team. More so to do with, his financial reasons than anything else. Slayton was willing to take a massive pay cut to come back and play with the New York Giants, and I think it paid off. It paid off in a big way because Slayton kind of cashed in. Got a pretty good deal this year for the New York Giants, one that he definitely wouldn't have been able to get last year on the open market. He was our best wide receiver last year, if we're being honest with ourselves. Him or Richie James, I suppose. But Slayton had a number of big plays for this football team, and he continues to at least be a big play threat on the outside. Now, when you look at this New York Giants wide receiving core, no, it's not top heavy. No, we don't have a superstar. But we have a lot of depth. We have a lot of twos and threes. I think this is going to be the most interesting position in training camp in terms of battles. And I think you're looking at several individual battles. You want to look at guys that do similar things in terms of trying to compete to make the back end of this roster. Obviously, the shoo-ins at the wide receiver position, outside of getting hurt in training camp, you figure Darius Slayton's a shoo-in. You figure Paris Campbell's a shoo-in. Hodgins, I think, is a lock, right? That's three right there, right off the bat. Then you got Jalen Hyatt. You got to figure the rookie is a lock to make this team as well. So you're at 4. The question is, how many wide receivers are we going to carry? Wan'Dale's obviously making the team. The question is, does he start on the pup? We'll have to wait and see how he responds to the injury. But if you want to include him, you're clearly at 5. And then you're talking about the back end of this roster at the wide receiver position. My guess is they go with 7. And if they go with 7, well, I'm going with Jeff Smith. I think he's going to make this team because of special teams. The Giants need a gunner. Right? You think back to Cody Core a few years ago. He was great in that spot. The Giants were really bad in special teams last year. I think that's a major reason why they brought him in. And because of that, if Jeff Smith shows out in camp, I think he stands a very good chance to make this team. And then that 7 spot, I think you're looking at a competition between several different players. Obviously, Shepard probably has the upper hand, but we don't know how he's going to look going in. Could clearly stick him on the pup. A guy that's very similar to Shepard in terms of play style is Crowder. He also brings special teams versatility as a kick returner. He's done that in the past, and maybe the Giants will look at it that way if he's going to make this team. Jamison Crowder, a veteran, he's had production throughout the NFL. But I think in terms of a skill set as a receiver, him and Shepard are fairly similar. That probably is a major reason why they brought him in to begin with, because they feel like Shepard, there's at least a chance, may not make the opening day roster. So we'll see how the veteran does in camp. You're also looking at Colin Johnson, and there's a number of other players. Of course, the undrafted free agent everybody's talking about, but we'll see how Wheaton plays out. All right, he's an undrafted free agent for a reason, but he's 6'4". He ran a 4.38. He's definitely going to be a guy to keep your eye on in training camp, and a guy that we're all going to be excited about. And if nothing else, I think stands a very good chance to at least stick on with the practice squad, right? You think back to Victor Cruz. It took him 2 years to make the team. David Sills took him 3. So we'll see. I think it's going to be tough for him to make this team, though, but you never know. Injuries can happen. And listen, I think Dable showed you last year that he doesn't care about your salary. He doesn't care about where you were drafted. He's gonna roster the guys that he feels gives him the best chance to win. And if Marcus Wheaton shows out in camp, he's got an opportunity. It's going to be tough, though, because like I said, you could argue right now in terms of overall depth, that may be our deepest position on this roster. Next up, we're going to look at the tight end position. And, of course, the major acquisition, at least from the offensive side of the ball. I think he's a 2-time Pro Bowler. Went over 1,000 yards 2 and 3 years ago, whatever it was, with the Raiders. One of the most talented pass-catching tight ends in the National Football League. And that, of course, is Darren Waller. And I think Waller is probably going to be the guy that catches the most touchdowns in this offense. I think he'll be featured. I'm excited to see how Kafka and Dable utilize him in this offense. With Buffalo, they never really had a tight end, but Dable's the type of guy that will adjust to his roster. There's a reason that the Giants surrendered a 3rd-round pick for Darren Waller. I think he's going to be the most featured guy from a passing standpoint in this offense. So really excited to see what they could do with him. In addition to him, I mentioned Myrick earlier. Maybe the Giants view him more as a fullback, being that that's what they rostered him last year. I don't know if he's going to make the team. I think that's far from a shoo-in. But outside of him, you've also got Daniel Bellinger. How could you forget about Mr. Bellinger? Bellinger last year out of San Diego State had a really good rookie season for the New York Giants. Of course, suffered that horrible eye injury where he got poked in the eye, but was really trending towards having a really nice year. And he's a good blocker. He's definitely a willing blocker, a good blocker, and a guy that is sure-handed. I think he had like a drop throughout his entire collegiate career, like maybe a few drops. Like that was the book on him coming in. Had a really, good hands. He's not the best athlete, but he's actually an underrated athlete. He ran a 4.65 40 or whatever it was for a man of his size. Was actually pretty impressive. He's not Darren Waller, but he's definitely a guy that is a very good tight end too. And you think about the improvement to this unit, Waller alone, I think puts Bellinger where he belongs, at least at this stage in his career. I think a tight end two and a guy that could potentially emerge into a tight end 1. So there's good depth there on that at the tight end spot. In addition to that, they brought in Tommy Sweeney, formerly of the Buffalo Bills, so some familiarity there, and Lawrence Cager. I think they're going to go with 7 wide receivers, as I said. My guess is they go with the 4 running backs. I think Brightwell stands a good chance to make the team. At the tight end position, I think they go with 3. And I think the two shoe-ins obviously are Waller and Bellinger. And then that third spot will probably be a competition between Tommy Sweeney and Lawrence Cager. Cager, the Giants started to utilize more in the offense as the year progressed. He actually had some catches in those playoff games. So we'll see what they kind of elect to do there, what they value more. But that'll be a battle in camp for sure, the back end of that tight end grouping. And it's certainly a much deeper group than it was last year just by the addition of Waller alone. Next up, we're going to go to the offensive line. In my opinion, as a unit, the most important unit on a football team. And it's a unit that in recent history has failed us as New York Giants fans. One guy that has certainly not failed us over the last couple of years since he's been a New York Giant has been that man. And that's Andrew Thomas. Thomas last year made second team All-Pro and is an emerging tackle that is still only 24 years old. I think he's 24. He might be 25. Still really young. And we all know that Andrew Thomas is going to cash in. The Giants, of course, gave him the fifth-year option. You knew that was going to happen. That's kind of just a buffer until the end of this year, where he signs a massive contract extension, much like what Dexter's going to do this offseason. Just a matter of when, not if. Both those guys are going to be in the long-term interest of this football team. And you can't be upset with paying your blindside protector, especially one as good as Andrew Thomas. And as great as Andrew Thomas is, he's the only good thing we had going on this line last year, right? So many holes on the interior. Evan Neal struggled as a rookie. He had some points in time where he was starting to show growth. Then he suffered the injury, and he really regressed as the year progressed, and we saw him get exposed, in the playoffs against the Eagles. But we'll see how that plays out throughout the rest of the offensive line. Outside of Andrew Thomas, we'll talk about the big addition in a minute, but you got Mark Lewinsky. He's coming back. I thought he was kind of an underwhelming signing last year, but the Giants didn't have much money to spend. They kind of needed a filler, a stopgap at that guard position. That's exactly what Lewinsky's going to be. He's going to be a Giant probably just for this year, 2 years with the team, and then they'll probably move on. And then maybe a guy like a Josh Azudu, a Marcus McKeithen, a Ben Bredesen replaces him long-term. I'm sure the New York Giants want to develop these younger players on this roster this year to potentially take over for Lewinsky next season. But obviously, Glow stands a very good chance to potentially crack the opening day starting lineup. He's clearly going to make the roster just based on his contract alone. Then you have Josh Azudu. I think he'll be, like I said, in a competition between Lewinsky and Bredesen for those guard spots. In addition to that, you got JMS, John Michael Smith, this year's second-round pick. I think he's a shoo-in. I think he's a shoo-in to start at the center spot. Now, will he struggle a bit early on? I'm sure he will. He's a rookie. But the good news there, I do think he will transition a lot faster than the average rookie. Reason being, he's 24 years old. He's been playing college football for a while. I think he'll make a pretty seamless transition into the NFL. He'll have his bumps early on, but I expect him to be steady at least by midseason this year for the Giants at a position that's been a revolving door really since our last Super Bowl. So it was great to see the New York Giants land JMS, and it kind of fills out the starting lineup on this offensive line. Evan Neal, that's the guy you got to talk about, right? I think is the X factor to this team this year. If Evan Neal could even become an average right tackle in the NFL, this New York Giants offense could go from pretty good to really good. I could see this offense cracking top 10 easily. Now, you got to be fair. You got to be objective. You got to look at the schedule. We're playing some damn good defenses. Dallas, good defense. Eagles, good defense. That's 4 games right there. You've got the 49ers, great defense. The Jets actually have a very good defense. So we're playing some very good defenses. So we'll be put to the test at times. But I still think if Evan Neal could take that big jump, this Giants offense could be a force in 2023. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying we're going to be the greatest show on turf, but I think we're going to be able to move the football if we could get some protection for Daniel Jones. And this offensive line is going to be vitally important. Outside of the guys I've mentioned, Marcus McKeithen, who I mentioned briefly, a younger player I'm looking for this year, hopefully to progress. Maybe as a long-term depth piece, maybe as a long-term starter. We'll see. I think he makes the team, obviously, being that Shane drafted him just last year out of North Carolina. You also got Phillips, who I think projects probably to be the swing tackle. He was inserted into the starting lineup last year at points in time when the Giants needed a filler for Evan Neal. Him and Parrott will probably be competing in camp for that spot there as the swing tackle. I'm leaning with Phillips as the favorite going in. You also have, I think it's pronounced Hassan Saucer, however it's pronounced, the center that we brought in from the Pittsburgh Steelers. I'm leaning he probably won't even make the team at this point, but he could. But I think they have a lot of younger options, and the fact that we drafted JMS, I think he's leaning more towards being a camp body, but he certainly could make the team. And then you got Wyatt Davis, who's still young, right? Former, I think he was an early second-round pick, maybe a first-round pick on the interior, former teammate obviously, of Evan Neal, of Andrew Thomas, I should say. So we'll see how it all plays out on the offensive line, but I certainly think we're deeper just with the addition of JMS, and you have to figure that Evan Neal progresses in year 2 for this football team. So when you look at the overall offense, where's the weakness? I mean, I think we're pretty deep at tight end. I think we're pretty deep at wide receiver. I think we're pretty deep at running back, quarterbacks, whatever. You're never going to be super deep there. I think every position group is improved. But, of course, we don't have a number one option. And there's still a lot of question marks on the offensive line. As excited as we are for JMS, he's still a rookie, albeit a 24-year-old rookie. He's still a rookie, right? Evan Neal still has a lot to prove. Can he take that big jump? I think he will, but we'll have to wait and see how that plays out. But there's still certainly some question marks on the offense, but I do think it'll be a much improved product this year. On the defensive side of the football, we're going to start with Sexy Dexy and the defensive line. This defensive line is actually really deep. This was like the weakness of this football team on the defensive side. It definitely was the weakness, which is ironic because you could argue 2 of our top 4 or 5 players on the defense were on the defensive line. But outside of them, we had nobody in terms of depth. Now, you had a monster in A'Shawn Robinson. A'Shawn Robinson, when he's on the field, and he's going to miss time, we all know that. He's had injury troubles throughout the past. But when Robinson is on the field, he is a run stuffer in every sense of the word. In addition to that, you added Nacho. That is quality depth in a division where you need it, going up against the Eagles' offensive line, going up against the Cowboys' offensive line. So Joe Shane did his best to address that this offseason. In addition to that, of course, Leo, the cat. Excited about him. Probably going to be his last year as a Giant. We'll see if they extend him. I'm leaning they won't, but they certainly could. And he's still a damn good football player. For him, it comes down to the contract and some of the other players that we're going to have to sign here long term. But Leonard Williams fits this defensive scheme really well. He's versatile. He's a damn good football player, and he should only benefit from some of the upgrades that we've had on this defensive line. Outside of that, Jihad Ward, kind of like an edge defensive line hybrid. He's not really strictly an edge rusher. He's kind of a guy that you can move on the, as a DN. He could play a little stand-up OLB. But I associated him here with the D-line. He'll probably be on the roster as an outside linebacker off the edge. But, again, a veteran, a guy that's obviously familiar with wing scheme. Good fit. Then you got DJ Davidson, the rookie who got hurt last year, and in addition to that, Jordan Riley. Both very similar players, both guys that project to be pretty much strictly run stuffers. Riley, the rookie in the 7th round, a 330-pounder out of Oregon. That'll be an interesting camp battle. I think there's a very good chance both could make it, even though they're very similar. Due to the fact that we drafted both of them recently. So we'll see how that all plays out. But definitely a much deeper unit than last year. And probably the strength of the defense. Next up, we're going to go edge rusher. And we're all excited about Kayvon, aren't we? I know I am. Kayvon Thibodeau last year definitely showed glimpses of being an elite edge rusher in the NFL. Is he an elite edge rusher yet? No. I also want to make note, I think they're going to go with 6 on the D-line. Is he an elite edge rusher? No. But I think he's going to be. And I think he's certainly trending that way. And I think this year could be the year where Kayvon Thibodeau really gets an opportunity to break out of his shell, right? You look at all the additions over this defense, more maturity on his part. You figure he puts on more muscle in the offseason. The physical skill set's there. We saw him single-handedly take over a football game against Washington under the bright lights. There's not a lot of players that could do that. He has that special trait. Right? We're all excited to see what Kayvon could do year 2 for this defense. But I think probably the most important player on this defense in terms of whether or not this defense could anoint itself as one of the upper echelon Ds in football. They're going to need him to become a high-end edge rusher in the NFL. And I certainly think he's capable of that. He's great. But what do you got outside of that? Azeez Ojulari got hurt last year, but obviously a ton of talent. Right? When he was on the field, he was productive. Rookie year, I think he had 8.5 sacks. Last year was productive when he played. Can he stay on the field? But that's all well and good. The starters are pretty strong there for the Giants. I'm not saying it's the best, but it's pretty good, especially with an emerging Kayvon Thibodeau. The question here is the depth. This was really the one position that Joe Shane did not really address this offseason. And he couldn't address all of them. He addressed everything else in terms of getting upgrades, at least partially, at pretty much every other position. But this position, he kind of let simmer. Cam Brown, more of a special teams guy, has a chance to make the team. O'Shane Ximines, they brought back on a contract today, 1-year deal. Actually played okay when thrown into the lineup last year when Kayvon wasn't able to start the year. He actually played pretty well for us, along with Jihad Ward early on. You forget about that as a Giants fan. Ellerson Smith, a guy with potential, but he's never really lived up to it. He's had a ton of injuries since he's been in the NFL. And then you got Timon Fox, I look at this unit, I say to myself, you hope Fox could step up. You hope that a guy like Ellerson Smith could step up, but we really lack depth here. I think this is probably the thinnest position group that we have currently on this roster, especially when you factor in that Aziz, up to this point in his career, has had injury problems. So if the Giants are able to add a veteran anywhere in free agency for a cheap price, similar like we did with Logan Ryan late in the offseason a few years ago, for a really cheap price the first time around, I think it would be the edge. A rotational edge, a veteran. I could see Joe Shane certainly attacking that as other teams start to trickle down to their 53-man roster. So we'll have to wait and see how that all plays out. But I certainly think that's a position group that the Giants could use an upgrade. Next up, speaking of upgrades, talk about an upgrade at the linebacker spot. Bobby Okereke out of Indianapolis. You go from Tay Crowder to one of the best young linebackers the sport has to offer. He's still only 25 years old. The dude had almost 300 combined tackles over the last 2 years. He's athletic. He fits the scheme well. Massive upgrade. Bad news is, much like we said about the edge, even though the Giants did do everything in their power to address this position, they spent $10 million a year on the position. This position was so bad last year, even with the addition of Okereke, we're still young. We're still thin, rather. You look at the rest of the grouping, you've got Gerard Davis, former early draft pick who played okay for the Giants. And I think he's a fine LB3. I don't love him as the LB2. I don't feel super comfortable with him as the LB2 going in. You have Micah McFadden, second-year pro. I could see him getting some playing time in sub packages. Carter Coughlin and Darian Beavers. I think he's the X factor. If this linebacker group could have an LB2, I would think it would be him, but we have to see how he responds to the injury. Maybe you could add a depth piece here. I don't think it's the end of the world if you don't have a great LB2 in this defense because there's so many packages in which they're going to have extra DBs and so on and so forth. But in an ideal world, you'd like to have a little more depth at that position. But I think they probably go with 5 guys at that position, and those will probably be the 5 guys that make the team. Finally, at the DBs, I'm going to talk about the guys that I think will make the team at the cornerback spot. Let's pull it up. 2 captains right there, or 2 guys that I project to be captains next year, and that's Adoree Jackson, that's Xavier McKinney. McKinney, of course, was a captain last year. We'll start with the cornerback spot. Adoree Jackson, really good player. I think he's kind of a tweener. I don't know if I would consider him like a legitimate CB1, but he's probably better than a CB2. He's a very good cornerback. I wouldn't necessarily consider him a lockdown, but he's a very good player for the New York Giants. Only question is, can he stay on the field? Yes, last year was kind of a fluke thing with the punt return, but he did miss some time the year before as well, and he's had injury troubles in the past. So you want more depth at this position. Outside of the wide receiver group, this may be the deepest position we have. Again, not a lot of superstars, but some young emerging talent at this position, the New York Giants. And it's important to have as many DBs as you can as you could get in this scheme. Along with that, you have the first-round pick, Deonte Banks, who I think obviously, depending on how he does in camp, projects to be the starter opposite of Adoree Jackson. Deonte Banks, sky's the limit, baby, but he's a rookie. You're going to expect growing pains, especially when you look at some of the wide receivers that these guys are going to have to guard. I mean, my goodness. Outside of our division, which, of course, you got A.J. Brown, you got Devontae Smith, you got the boys over in Dallas with CeeDee Lamb, Brandon Cooks, Washington. They're loaded. They have a lot of good wide receivers. Not that good of a football team, not that good of a quarterback, but they got wide receivers, obviously with Scary Terry, obviously with Jahan Dotson, Curtis Samuel, right? So they've got weapons. But outside of the division, look at some of the wide receivers these guys are going to be going up against this year. Stephon Diggs, Devontae Adams, Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle. You're talking about some of the best wide receivers the sport has to offer. So it was important for the Giants really to upgrade this corner group. There's going to be growing pains. They're young. They're inexperienced. But I'm excited to see what Deonte Banks could do in year 1. Outside of him, you got Cordell Flott, second-year pro. I think showed flashes last year for the Giants of being a guy with potential. He's certainly got that attitude. You'd like him to put on a little bit more muscle, but he's got potential, I think, long-term to be the CB2 and a guy that may end up being the slot corner out of camp, depending on how he plays. I hope I pronounced this right. I'm not going to. I've watched several highlights. Amani Uorare, well, however it's pronounced, out of Detroit. He had 6 interceptions in 2021. You know how many interceptions the New York Giants had last year as a team? 6. Now, he's not very good in coverage. He had a 30 PFF grade last year, but he's at least a guy that provides some veteran depth. He's still relatively young. I think he's 27, and I do think he'll make this team. They brought him in for a reason. He has starters experience from within the league. So I think he's kind of a veteran in terms of depth that this team could really use. Probably, he's going to be a backup. I don't think he's going to be a starter, but certainly a guy that's probably going to make this team. Aaron Robinson, we'll see how they feel about him. Of course, wasn't drafted by this regime, but was a highly thought of prospect coming in. A lot of people felt like he was a second-round talent that the New York Giants got in the third round, got hurt last year. I think he fits this defense very well. I think he projects better in the slot. And if he is healthy, I think it'll be a really good competition between him and Cordell Flott in training camp. Darnay Holmes, I think, is the odd man out. And I think it's more to do with financials than anything else, much like Darius Slayton last year. Now, if Darnay Holmes is willing to take a major pay cut and come back, possible. But the fact that you could save nearly $3 million if you cut him and he's not the best player in the world, I think there's a good chance that the New York Giants at least reduce his salary going into camp. So I could certainly see him being the odd man out in this grouping. I already mentioned Deonte Banks. You have Trey Hawkins, who I'm really excited about as well. 6th-round pick. I think he'll be a really good contributor on special teams for the New York Giants and a guy that maybe could mold into a long-term starter. In addition to that, we'll talk about the safety group real quick. You got Bobby McCain, veteran, taking over for Julian Love. Not quite as good, probably. Actually, definitely. That's a spot where I think we took a step back. You got Xavier McKinney, one of the better players on this defense. Really excited to see what he could do year 2 in this defense, along with the rookie Owens, Pinnock, and Belton. So Belton's a guy that I think could compete, but that's good competition there in that secondary. The majority of the guys I mentioned, I think, make this team. I think they go with probably 11 DBs. So most of those guys, I think, stand a very good chance to make this team, but I'm sure they'll bring in competition throughout. The one thing I look on this roster, is it a complete roster in terms of being a Super Bowl ready roster? No. I think there's still some more building to do, but I think we're getting closer. This year's roster is undeniably much better, at least on paper, than last year's roster. Of course, the games are played on the field, and this year the New York Giants will have a target on their back. Teams are not going to take them lightly this year. We'll see how this team responds, but I'm excited to see the boys in blue get ready for camp. As always, guys, if you like what you watch, please subscribe, drop a comment, maybe give me a little thumbs up. Cheers.